All right. I think we'll get started. We have a lot to cover in very little time, 45 minutes to figure out research and personalized learning. Small topic. Thank you all for joining us here. My name is Vic Vuchic. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer at Digital Promise Global, and I head up an initiative called the Learner Variability Project. And I have with me here three amazing leaders in the field of research and philanthropy as well. So Betheny Gross, who's at the Center for Reinventing Public Education at the University of Washington, and does a lot of leading research around implementation of personalized learning. We have John Pane, who's at the RAND Corporation and is one of the leaders in efficacy and evaluation research, large scale, whether it's trials or rollouts, and did the famous Gates study, headed up that work around the efficacy of personalized learning. And Katrina Stevens, who's a director of learning science at the Zuckerberg initiative, and kind of sees a broad perspective across many, many different initiatives. And previously she was a deputy director at the Office of Education Technology in the Obama administration. So thank you all. Real quick, I'd love to just see, just show of hands of who's kind of in the room. So how many folks here are administrators? All right. How about teachers, practitioners? Okay, that's great. Researchers? EdTech product developers? And did I miss anything? Funders.
You may not want to raise your hand.
Yeah, exactly. Talk to them. No, just kidding. All right. So to kind of organize this panel, we have about 30 minutes or so, and then we're going to have open QA. So please think of really good questions for us. And I wanted to put out a framework. Research is a really broad term. There are different kinds of research, and I find often people are kind of talking past each other about just foundationally different types of research for different purposes. And one framework that we developed that I think helps organize that is we broke it into kind of three components. First, there's kind of learning science research. And this is research about how people learn, the cognitive science, neuroscience, psychology, and that's kind of the basal learning science. Then there's design and implementation research. And so this is how, when you go into practice, how do you implement and design, whether it's programs or systems, and how do you do continuous improvement and roll that out. And then there's kind of efficacy research, which is, do these things work or not? You know, once we go through this process, does it have the impacts or effects that we hypothesized and thought about? And the great news is that we have expertise across all three of those areas up here, and we're going to kind of walk through some of that. So I wanted to kick off with kind of a backwards design process, starting with the efficacy. Does personalized learning work or not? Yeah, I think that's the wrong question, but what do we know about what's working, what do we understand about efficacy of personalized learning as it's rolled out, and how should we think about that? John.
Well, I'll start by saying I don't think we know very much yet. There's probably a few of you in this room who have heard me speak before about the Gates research that we performed from about 2012 to 2017. And you would think by now I would have something else to talk about, but actually very little research has been happening in terms of evaluating personalized learning, at least in a rigorous way. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with the Gates, I'll give a brief recap of that and then talk a little bit about some of the things we're thinking about. By the way, we are doing a little bit of research ourselves on personalized learning, but not the kind of large-scale efficacy work that is represented by that Gates study. And I'm not aware of any large studies like that underway right now. We've been trying to get them started, but for efficacy, I think we're going to have to wait a little longer, because partly the Gates study is not a definitive study. That study found, on average, that schools that were implementing personalized learning school-wide, all grade levels, all subjects, on average performed better than a comparison group of schools from around the country. And the size of the effect was modest. Some schools actually produced large effects, and depending on which analysis we did and which groups of schools we included, the effect sizes vary, but they were positive and significant in math, and almost in the most recent study, almost the same size but not significant in reading. That's for a single year. When you look across multiple years, it appears that the effects are cumulative. So students who are experiencing personalized learning in those schools made further gains the second year. So a modest effect, if it continues to accumulate over time, could actually turn into a much larger effect. But as I mentioned, the kind of study that we did is not the most rigorous. It's a comparison design, which has the potential to produce misleading results depending on whether there are factors that we weren't able to control for that differed between these schools and the rest that we were comparing against. So the risk is that these positive effects, while they look promising, won't hold up or might not be the same magnitude if we do a more rigorous study, and that's what I'm hoping will happen sometime soon. In the meantime, I think it's important to think about the size of the effects that we were seeing when we looked at individual schools, because those varied from large and positive to large and negative. And about 1/3 of the schools that were doing this produced negative treatment effects by our estimation, and they were significant in many of those cases. So that tells me that there's a lot of variation, and that unfortunately, our study was not able to explain why those differences occurred, why some were succeeding, some were not. Later, we will talk about implementation. I don't want to monopolize the conversation right now. We have some ideas about perhaps things that might not work so well, but the upshot is that it's not a slam dunk. It's not guaranteed to work, and we need to keep trying to understand what the sources of the variation are, what are the things that work, and how can we avoid those that don't.
It's great. Wonderful kind of overview, and I think hearing, first of all, general positive effects, but high variability, and the interesting notion of kind of cumulative effects. And I think research on curriculum sees the same thing. Often the first year you roll out a curriculum, there's not much effect, but then the second year, once the teachers get used to it, they've customized it a bit, then it starts to grow from there. Often.
Well, that's not quite exactly what I was saying.
Oh, okay.
There is this sort of implementation dip that occurs when something new is implemented by a teacher, and usually they rebound and do better the second year and so forth. That's, when you're looking at the teachers. What I was talking about is having the students experience it multiple years. So where a student is in a personalized learning school, say it's a middle school, and they're in there for 4 years or 3 years, there is the potential that over those 4 years that there would be a larger cumulative effect than we measured in 1 year.
That's great. Thanks for the clarification. That's important. So great setup for implementation and design. This is a big shift across systems and practice. In your research, what are you seeing kind of are the big components that have an impact in terms of and our best practice in terms of strong rollouts of personalized learning that are getting some of these positive effects?
Okay. Well, I'm probably going to start similarly to the way John did, and it's to say that we actually haven't seen a lot of really great rollouts of, I think, what people who kind of are, kind of sitting back in their chairs and imagining what personalized learning could look like in schools. Yeah. We're not seeing a whole lot of that. I will, so a little bit of context on the study that I can comment on right now. So John and I have actually been on this similar panel for about 1.5 years now.
It's a roadshow.
and at some point, it always comes up. So I was studying within the same grant initiatives that John was studying, and we've always lamented the fact that our studies were actually never really tied. So while John has lots of great data and analysis of the extent to which schools showed improvement in the student test scores, and I've got lots of information on what schools were doing in that effort, our studies are not actually tied together, so I can't say what mattered for what John saw. Yep. This is something we're trying to remedy in future work, but for now. But what I do have is some insight as to why John saw the degree of variation that he did, including some of the very negative and positive. Or plausibly why. And so I was studying schools that were largely schools that were embedded in school districts, although there were a handful of charter schools, so there was a mix of them. They had all received grants. Their districts or a partner to the school had all received a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to seed and launch new efforts around personalized learning. There was some general direction that was offered, but it was a very open sort of figure this out, build the system that you think makes the most sense. The foundation's purpose in investing in districts and these external partners was because they had the sense that they'd spent a lot of time with individual schools and learned from that, but at the end of the day, personalized learning was not going to be a way of awash our schools without really investing in some of the systems, our district systems or the external organizations that support our school systems to pursue personalized learning. This was an ambition to not only just see if we can get it in a few schools, but actually see if it can become part of a bigger system of learning. In fairness, we were there for just a few years of this effort, we should understand that the ambitions were really very high for what would change. I think it's not unusual for us to think, around as personalized learning as taking on a whole new set of outcomes that we're interested in. It's not just we want to see students' academic performance improve, but we also want to see them progress socially and emotionally and have a more sort of whole child perspective on where kids are going. So this is a very ambitious enterprise in the context of a school system and a school policy system that is still largely oriented around test scores and academic performance. So all of that is important context. What we learned about what matters for implementation, or what we hypothesized based on what we saw worked and didn't work. We underinvest in helping our educators understand what we mean by these new goals that we've put on the table. Think about how much time we spent sort of telling people, training teachers on standards and the Common Core standards and what those were, and then we numbered them all and we made a very elaborate schema about it. But then we said, but now we'd like you to develop a child's autonomy and independence and agency, and offered none of the support and training. We just sort of assumed that everybody got what that meant and moved forward. But it actually is a really complicated and nuanced and complex set of relationships and exchanges and learning that leads to somebody assuming good agency in their lives. And we didn't really invest in that, and we certainly didn't invest in any sort of measurement around that. The second thing I think we underinvested in or have examined in the context is the adult learning that needs to be developed in these school buildings and in the faculties. This is a change that calls for a lot of iterative learning and development and shifting, and arguably something that needs to happen constantly. But this kind of learning is actually not the norm for what professional development looks like, for what adult learning in schools looks like. And so, we do lob in terms like PDSA cycles into it, but I don't think we've really truly invested in the ways that are going to help teachers get to that. And the third thing I would say at the school level, I've got lots of things on the system, but we'll just focus on the school today, is we didn't pay enough attention, and we haven't yet paid enough attention to the capacity and support for leaders, the school building leaders. I was in the last session, if anybody was in there, and there was some discussion in that about, right now we're just seeing like the teacher over there and the classroom over there, and it's not it's not becoming a coherent school initiative in a lot of places. And that's really, that is really kind of the domain of the building principal and the leader of the building to be able to kind of shepherd this change across a faculty and in a way that's supportive of the whole idea.
Fantastic. Super helpful. And I think, just to highlight, so it sounds like not clarity in what we really mean by these expanded goals that are often hard to measure as well. Supporting adult learning in better, more flexible and kind of continuous development ways, and then leadership support for kind of creating the context where we can do this kind of work. So that's excellent. So we start with efficacy, kind of design and implementation. I'm going to touch briefly on some learning sciences. So I head up a project called the Learner Variability Project, and in the learning sciences, there's a lot more research coming out. You're hearing about neuroscience and psychology and advances in understanding how learners learn. One of the areas that I think there's more and more energy going towards is translating that research to make it actionable and kind of integrating it so that it's kind of this more whole child perspective. So what does social emotional learning mean for if you're learning to read or if you're learning math? And so with the Learner Variability Project, for example, we created these open source models to help answer this question. If you are going to personalize learning, what does the learning science say are the big areas that kids vary in that we know has an impact on outcomes? And so we have these visualizations that highlight those factors as kind of hot spots, and then we have a whole database of strategies, product design and instructional strategies that you can use according to the research to support kids in that. And if you're designing environments and programs, it helps you use that research in a much more easy way to really design for that full diversity of learners. And so it's at lvp.digitalpromise.org, and it's all open source, and we're working with product developers and administrators and program designers to help infuse that research into the design process. So with that, Katrina, you're at CZI and you're a funder. You get to see kind of all of it. You get a pretty broad perspective in how these things integrate or how they struggle to integrate. And where they're kind of hot spots of good work that we can really learn from. And so can you help us see that and understand that?
It's an exciting time, because in some ways we're still in the early days of what I think personalized learning can become.
Absolutely.
At Zuckerberg, one of the things that we believe pretty deeply is that technology can help be able to support teachers who are trying to develop relationships with their students and be able to give them more information and be able to find the resources more quickly that they need to be able to personalize. And so like the technology is starting to catch up.
Yep.
But also at the same time, the learning science is also we're starting to really deeply understand and learn more about what kinds of practices really do have the biggest impact. And then thinking about, okay, how do you actually implement those into personalized learning systems? Like, I mean, what does that look like? And how are you, and particularly the tricky part is like, how do you measure some of those things? Like you were talking about, that it's not just about the academic outcomes, but a lot of the other things that we really truly care about. Yep. So we spend a lot of time at CZI kind of thinking through and supporting projects that are around those pieces of it. In some ways, our team's called the Learning Science team, but in some ways it's a bit of a misnomer, because in some ways we're a little more like learning engineering, because we do less kind of basal research, and it's really more about how do we take what we know about how people learn, and how do you implement that in schools and into tools, which is a whole different thing. And I would also go a little bit further in terms of like, there's been a lot of efforts around translating research. That we're really kind of pushing in to see if there's ways that it's actually much more of a bidirectional loop. We've been supporting a number of efforts around how do we get educators to really be sourcing, like, here's the things I care about, help me get the research and help me participate in being able to understand and put in the measures that are useful for me. And so kind of changing that paradigm in terms of really having educator voice be part of those kinds of conversations. I would echo definitely. We kind of joke around that adults have brains too, which includes teachers. And so we talk about rolling out all these efforts. And one thing that I think is particularly ironic is I've seen really good efforts around student agency, but in the rollout, they forget about teacher agency. And it's like you need to actually be thinking about both of those things in terms of, so it's really important to be thinking about like what does that professional development look like for teachers. And if you're taking teachers and you're sticking them in a room for a couple of days at the beginning of the school year, I used to work at central office in Baltimore County Public Schools. You sit them in front of the room for 2 days, and then like that's their training. That is not in any way personalized. So it's like, how do we think about changing that practice, and how do we make sure, a good example of a learning science principle is practice and feedback. We know that lots of practice and feedback is core to learning, but we don't actually do that for teachers. Like we don't have very few methods for places where you're really developing how can we give teachers ongoing feedback so they can get better and better, and particularly in ways that they want. Like teachers actually actively really love to get feedback. And similarly, I would echo the need for change management in the sense of I've seen teachers who are doing some really wonderful work in classrooms, but not having the rest of the infrastructure in place to be able to really do that. And it really is, if you're truly going personalized learning, it's a whole system change. You've got to think about everything from procurement even, but really like what does the school day look like? How does the professional learning get scheduled into all these things? And it's a much bigger piece. It's not just simply like, okay, we'll get some technology in here and then suddenly we'll all work. So a lot of different kinds of things around.
But I think some real key areas, educator voice, improving and increasing feedback, especially for the teachers. I know we have our micro-credentials initiative, and part of the theory of action is if teachers can experience personalized learning themselves, then they'll become stronger advocates for it as well overall. And then kind of change management at sort of leadership and systems level to create the conditions for success and moving forward. It's excellent. Great. So John, let me ask you, so we have actually an interesting mix here of practitioners, administrators, product developers. As they're going about trying to roll out, design, and even instrument kind of personalized learning, whether it's in an environment or a school, if they're thinking about understanding efficacy, what are some of the key things and best practices that they should do to try to move that forward and understand that?
Sure. Well, so first of all, I think that it's useful to think about how the school or district is considering going about personalized learning. Are they going to pick some well-established model and implement it? The most prominent example right now is Summit, where Summit has a professional development program. They have a very coherent system that could sort of convey a common message to all the educators. Now, Summit, as far as I know, does not have evidence of efficacy. I don't know if that's happening as we speak. But there, at least, some of the things I'm going to say may not apply because you're not sort of building it yourself. But what I encounter the most when I talk with administrators and educators who are experimenting or piloting personalized learning is that they are building systems themselves. And there, I think it's a much more challenging endeavor. And I do think that while the direct evidence from personalized learning is not there to help, some of the things that sort of surround that can be helpful in trying to make good choices about what you're doing. And I'll mention a few of those. So first of all, if you are bringing technology or other particular defined programs in as a component of your personalized learning system, there are clearinghouses of research on those kinds of systems. The What Works Clearinghouse, there's also the Best Evidence Encyclopedia. Those are two resources that really try to filter through the evidence and show you the evidence for products or components that could be have evidence for themselves, not and then of course you're doing other things too, but at least you're starting with some perhaps items or pieces that have that efficacy evidence. When you don't have that kind of evidence, then I do think that the correct thing to do is rely on the learning sciences, as has been a theme for two of our speakers here. And we do see, when we look out there at what people are doing with personalized learning, there do seem to be practices being adopted that may not be well supported by learning sciences. As two examples, People often try to adapt instruction to the learning style of the student, and that particular idea has undergone a tremendous amount of research and has not shown to be an effective approach. The other thing is, while I see the value and merit in giving students agency and some of the decision making that involves in their educational process, there's a lot of important things that they could gain from that. We do need to be careful because there is learning science research that says that the individual is not always the best person to decide how to go about learning or what the best thing is. And furthermore, when you have students picking things, who's going to vet them and make sure that they're rigorous in a way that, if you purchase a curriculum or a textbook, you have a pretty good idea that it's rigorous. So once you start to open the door to just picking stuff up off the internet without the evidence, without understanding the learning science basis, then there's a lot of risk, I think, because people can start doing things that are not productive, wasting time, and that goes both for the students' use of time and for the teachers too. Either if the teachers are scrambling around looking for things, or if the teachers are vetting things because the students came up with something and they need to check it. All of those things can put a lot of time burdens, and the question then becomes, are we losing efficiency in terms of the educational process? Are kids going to learn as much? Maybe they'll get more agency skills, but are they going to learn the content? Do we care about that? And of course, if you're doing personalized learning, that doesn't mean you have to throw away the existing rigorous materials that are out there. Common Core curricula, textbooks. There are ways to have a personalized learning system that still uses those resources, and they can be online, not just paper textbooks. And so again, in the interest of trying to make sure that you don't make a misstep in terms of picking up content or materials that are not going to be effective, it may be good to at least start out relying on things that have a coherence and have been validated over some period of time. And then the final point I'll make is that when you're doing that kind of experimentation, it's important to monitor what's going on and make corrections if you see that things aren't working.
Excellent. So some key points there that I think are really important. One thing I will observe is that you use the term rigorous quite often. And so really being thoughtful about rigorous curriculum or supports, and keeping that there, and being careful of, yes, you want to open up so kids develop agency, but it's not a Wild West, and often we're actually, research shows, not the best judges of our own learning. I know when I studied with Dan Schwartz, he said, how many times did you say, I think I got a B on that test, and you get it back and you got a D? You're like, oh, oops. So it's not always just totally obvious. But it looked like you want to jump in and add.
We've got CCI, we have a close partnership with Summit, which has about 400 schools that are using the Summit Learning Platform right now. And so at CCI, we are incredibly committed to whole child, learning science, and kind of deep, rigorous research. And so we're excited about partnering with Summit as they start to kind of continue to build out their measures. So right now they have measures for teacher agency, student engagement, and I think there's one other one. And we're actually helping them develop additional measures to be able to really understand. There's a lot of continuous improvement that's built into the system, and we're looking forward to actually looking at more, really being able to study better, what are the long-term impacts of that. And so we're excited about doing that work.
Fantastic.
There's actually one thing that you talked about that where you said match comparison isn't quite as rigorous. And I'm excited about a project that's happening in the UK. They are taking, so the UK has a student database that runs from pre-K all the way. They just added even college and added higher and workforce. So we don't actually have access to this kind of database. But what they're doing is they've been, the Education Endowment Foundation, which is like our IES, they have been running RCTs. And what they've done is they've hired someone from Harvard, who is going back and doing match comparisons against all the RCTs. And so it'll be interesting to come out of that is that if we can actually show like how close are they?
Yeah.
And I think then we would, because we can't do that kind of study here, but we might be able to do, like, we'll be able to learn, like, is it like several match comparisons are equivalent to an RCT?
Yep.
Or like, what does that look like? So I'm excited to find out.
That's really
Because
cool.
like, we have to do mostly match comparison, just given the way our schools are set up. It's hard to actually do the kind of like true RCT in a lot of places.
Absolutely. And RCT is randomized controlled trial,
yes.
kind of a rigorous process that they use often in medicine and health for testing out and isolating effects. Bethany, I do want to touch on, we're again running out of time a bit, but can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing as best practices in terms of implementation around supporting the practitioners, particularly, and also the kind of integration between administrators and practitioners? I think that's often probably a tough area, and what are you seeing come up as key components for that to go well?
So I think that the relationships between the administrators and the teachers in all of the schools, almost all of the schools that we went to, is really very positive. So this wasn't a case where the teachers were sort of doing something that the administrator was nervous about, or vice versa. But the question is, how well did their capacities come together to support this work forward? And that's where things got a little bit messy. So one thing to understand about the principals in these scenarios is, and this is what we heard this over and over again from principals, is that they have received the message that the learning in that building should look very different than the learning that was happening before, and the learning that was happening when they themselves were educators, and when they themselves had been developed all of their capacity to do educational leadership, which instructional leadership that we've charged principals with for all of these years. So oftentimes the principals would confess to us that they were really at a loss as to how to support their staff to do this work going forward. That they felt like they weren't going to be in a good position to judge the quality of the classrooms they were now stopping into, that they weren't in a good position to help their teachers find and vet new material and instructional lessons and things like that. So they were feeling very vulnerable in these positions. And what they were not being supported to do is what Katrina pointed out, is be effective leaders of change. So leaders of change don't always need to know exactly where you're going, but they need to help structure the direction there. And in the couple of cases where we did see buildings really kind of start to cohere and coalesce around a strategy, where we saw good exchange and learning and feedback cycles happening, what we saw first and foremost was a principal who was really very skilled at knowing when to sort of open the door for folks to go explore things, but also kind of shut things down when it was time to kind of make a decision and become a place that was, here's who we are,
yep,
and this is what we do. So, and this is actually kind of like, and this is like legendary in leadership research, the ability to kind of strategically open and close.
Yep.
Give people license, but also make it very clear that we're going to converge, and some things are going to be shed along the way. And so that was,
I think that's a great framing, and I know in innovation in general and design thinking, often they talk about when are you flaring and when are you focusing, right? And being intentional about that is really important to be able to move forward and not just kind of end up in a Wild West.
yeah. And there were known and transparent systems for doing that in the building, so that there were strategies that the teachers had for when they would go find things out and discover things and test things, and when they would come back and look at data and say, this is the thing that I think was most effective for us.
Great. Excellent. So we have about 10 minutes left. And so I wanted to open up any questions that folks have, any Q&A. There's a microphone right here in the middle if you can go so everyone can hear about.
Hello. So my name is Roger Taylor. I'm a learning scientist and now learning engineer, which is a new term, or applied learning scientist. So I do work on students affective states and their learning. And I was wondering if there are any organizations that you know of that would be kind of amenable to including that in their personalized learning, kind of how they customize things.
So Summit is a great example. I mean, that is like, we're looking as we're thinking through, the learning science team works very closely with the whole child team, which is looking at what is like a broader conception of success, and like deeply understanding that even in academics, all of those pieces actually have a huge impact on whether or not someone's like ready to learn and is wanting to learn. So those are things that we're looking at, and including actually what are some measures that, like, how do you actually capture that? How do you help teachers be able to know how to do those things? Sure.
Absolutely. Anyone else? Any comment on that? Any other questions or things you want to know about the research, where it is, or insights?
Yes, I do.
Go for it.
Hi, my name is Emily Gates. I'm an assistant professor of evaluation at Boston College. Two of my students here from our MESA department. And we're just getting involved in this space in terms of thinking about how to evaluate personalized learning. Yeah. And our big question that we would love to hear your answer on is the relationship between personalized learning and equity in terms of access and equity across different student outcomes. And we're not just interested in student academic assessment data, but equity in terms of some of the other kinds of outcomes we care about.
All right. John, do you want to start?
I could say a little bit about that. I've done some thinking about equity in terms of the opportunity to target instruction to the student's current ability, and in contrast to the way the system works now, where if students enter school behind or fall behind early in their educational career, they're really not catching up. They're being dragged through grade by grade and always suffering from this circumstance where they're trying to learn something where they're not really adequately prepared. So in my mind, the idea of rethinking that and targeting every child's instruction to what they're ready to learn and building on the success of that and always having them have all the prerequisites before they attempt something is a potential way to serve those children that we have been not serving well up until now. But I think there's a risk that goes with that, and that is that when you take that approach, you make an implicit acknowledgement that even though this kid is sitting in a class with all these other children, they're maybe not ready to learn this, or they need to work on something more basic. And the risk is that somehow they will be set aside, and actually it will somehow magnify their lack of opportunity to learn things. So I think it's a tricky issue, something I don't have an answer to except to be aware that there's sort of a dichotomy there in terms of the potential reward and the risk.
I'm really excited about using learning science actually in terms of looking at the equity issues. One of our first questions on our grants when we do grant making is, will this increase or decrease inequities? Like it's literally the lens that we look at all of our grant making through. And for me, it's like thinking about executive function would be a good example. Like one of the things we've learned about executive function is that it is something that you can be taught, that there's training that you can do. And that in fact, when students who are coming from circumstances where they're not developing that executive function is kind of natural development, that you can train students on that executive function and it becomes a protective, which means that they are just as likely to be able to be successful. And so I think that it's like finding those places. And another one they will look at is like identity. If a student is sitting in a classroom and thinks people that look like me or come from my background don't do math, then that's a very different way of thinking. Like your intervention in that situation is very different than if it's really about a student's actually missing gaps. Like so, the more we can kind of personalize and understand the whole picture of a child and what kind of how they're kind of entering into that learning, the more we can actually personalize the response in terms of really helping them. And that's more than just academics. It's actually that kind of all of the wraparound that they're bringing into that. So I think it's actually some exciting ways that we can start looking at that.
I mean, I'll situate myself in between John and Katrina. But observationally, we saw exactly what John was describing, like the risks that we saw in cases the great benefits, but also those risks. And I think it connects to, Katrina was explaining that the notion of when we give kids executive function or help them develop their executive function, then they can move forward. The problem is when teachers were doing this work, and I think in part because they didn't fully understand sort of the process of taking that headstrong 5-year-old and making them a fully actualized 18-year-old, and the developmental stages along the way, they actually hadn't, what they had in front of them were kids who had different levels of executive functions, but they didn't have the capacity or the understanding of how to level that playing field first. So what we saw a lot of were classrooms that were pursuing this, creating a lot of opportunity for independence among kids, but kids who were already possessing the capacity to be self-starters, already possessing the capacity to have the metacognitive skills to understand, their learning and where they were doing great. And there were these kids who were almost, you will see them on the perimeter of classrooms. They are in the back row, they are on the side. They're sometimes flipping through computers really, really quickly, and they're not doing anything. This was happening, so that connection point, the space between what John was describing and what Katrina was describing is not quite clicking. And I think it goes back to that, how well do our educators fully grasp all of that complex the complex transactions, around these more social and emotional skills.
And I do worry, as a former educator, I worry about the burden we're putting on teachers. I guess we're kind of asking them to shift an entire model without giving them the time and the training and honestly the tools. The tools are still developing to be able to help them do those pieces of it. So I think, and similar to when you think about we often think about how do you help with teachers with their own stress management?
Yeah.
And recognizing there's a lot.
They're working very, very hard.
Yes.
I will tell you that.
Yeah.
They're working very, very hard.
And I think I'll just highlight one other theme in our work that's come up is that's kind of underlying is, first, there has to be a mindset that all kids can achieve, right? That it's not that, some kids will be slower or not be able to do this or not be able to do that. Because and you have to hold those high expectations across that. And we're actually in a week going to be putting out a report on a national survey we did, kind of exploring, do teachers and parents really truly believe that all kids can succeed, or is it just, no, only part of the population is going to do well, the rest? Because that kind of, if you have low expectations and expect some kids are just going to be on the sides, then there's going to be tremendous equity issues. The good news is, actually, the results were surprisingly positive. Most people did really believe that all kids can achieve high levels in the education system. That'll come out in a week on the Digital Promise website. So with that, I think we're at time. But thank you to our panelists. This is wonderful. And thank you to everyone here participating for the great questions.
Thank you.